Well, we get a lot of questions about the Republican Party, and what's happened to it. This is not my mom and my daddy's Republican Party. Well, the Republican Party, quite honestly, has been deteriorating for many, many years now, and the reality of it is, we are just now seeing the effects of it. And what was exacerbated by Trump in many respects certainly didn't begin with him. So my guest today on the podcast is Dana Milbank. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Deconstructionists, the 25-year crack of the Republican Party. And we get into exactly how this crack was formed, how the party gave up trying to mend the crack, and now how we are living as that crack further widens and we see a lot of the ugly underbelly of our politics. Dana is also a political columnist for the Washington Post, whose work is syndicated nationally and has also been a contributor to CNN and MSNBC. So stick around and join us for a great conversation with Dana Milbank right after this. Well, everyone, like I said, we've got one of Washington's very fine reporters and individuals who kind of had their finger in the pulse of a lot of what's not going on just here in D.C., but around the country. And as I said, it's encapsulated in his new book, The Deconstructionists. So, Dana, welcome, man. It's great to have you in the house.
It's good to be with you, Governor. Mr. Chairman, what can I got all kinds of titles.
I know. His brother can't make up his mind what he wants to do. That's what it is. But the book is, as I said to you before we started the conversation, the book is a good read because it gives some very interesting contextual observations. It's almost really, in one sense, like real-time reporting, covering. I mean, I know a lot of it may be based around stories that you covered at the time, but you still have this sort of current feel about it. What were you trying to capture before we get into the substance of it? What did you really want to try to capture about this period, which is pretty extensive, about 25, 30-year period that you walk us through?
Right. So I wanted to go back to the time. It was, the time Newt Gingrich arrived as Speaker of the House was almost exactly the time I arrived in Washington as a young reporter. So I had, as you alluded to there, I had reported on a lot of this. I was with the Wall Street Journal at first, and then I went to the New Republican, eventually to the Post. So I was reporting on this at the time. I wanted to go back as an exercise to go back through this, once we got into the Trump era. And I was surprised about the extent to which I saw all these things that were sort of, I didn't realize at the time, obviously, but were sort of precursors to what we're seeing now. They were sort of lesser incarnations of what Trump brought to us. So you could sort of see these antecedents as leading the way to Trump, or at least breaking things down in a way that made Trump possible, if not inevitable. So, it was basically going back through events that I lived through, that you lived through, and understanding them in a different context of what came afterwards. And there were a lot of aha moments, even though, these, as I said, were things that I'd lived through.
Yeah, you note pretty much at the outset of the book, this book will show that Donald Trump didn't create this noxious environment. He isn't some hideous orange Venus emerging from the shell, which, I still hideous and still orange, but I get your point. Rather, he is a monster the Republicans created over a quarter century. And as someone who's played a role in that process and had done various battles, I can't disagree with that analysis. I think it's a fair point. It's part of the internal battle that really emerged and crystallized after Reagan left office in 1989
Mm-hmm.
around the question, who will be the next Reagan? But
Mm-hmm.
even before that, we saw how Reagan kind of played to that when he launched his presidential campaign in 1980 in Mississippi, right? Sort of a bone to deep segregationists in the South, whom Republicans knew the only way to win the White House was through the South, because the Democrats had controlled so much of that. But even going back, Dana, when you go back and you look at, for example, the John Birch Society in the early 1960s, and that, again, flirtation with embracing white nationalism. The difference for me when you're looking at the arc, and I'm wondering if you found this in not only in your reporting, but in your crystallizing this narrative in the book, was leadership. It was the party back in the 60s, which was all in on civil rights, elevating the African-American experience to something better than Jim Crow, et cetera, even though it started to fray at the edges, that eventually fell into the sewer with Nixon's Southern strategy, Goldwater's, sort of repelling away from civil rights with his nomination in 64. That a lot of these, this was something in the making, but the leadership was there to sort of push back on it. What, for me, sort of makes this period with Trump so different is that the leadership was like, okay, yeah, let's do that.
Right. That's exactly right. And what it was is what was once the fringe became the mainstream. So, I think your framing of it is right. I think, if we go back to the 1960s, I mean, both parties were a whole lot less homogenous than they are today. You had, a wide ideological spectrum in both parties. But the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the immigration law, all in the 1960s, I think propelled us in a different direction. Lyndon Johnson famously said, there goes the South. So I think there was that was the beginning of this realignment, which I would argue, and I don't know if you agree, but today, perhaps what's defining our politics more than anything else is the racialization of it. That it's not just by race, but it's how you view race. So if you are supportive of the idea of a multicultural America, well, you're probably almost certainly going to vote Democratic. And if you are uncomfortable with that, you're almost certainly going to vote Republican. But this was, it took a while to get to that point, and it actually was with the arrival of the Republican Revolution in '94, the Democrats lost their majority in the South. So that was the period when the old segregationist Democrats, who began to surrender power in the 1960s, at that point were basically completely gone or all but gone. So that was a real. That was sort of the realignment really came into its own at that point. So, and that's also why I decided to begin my narrative at that point. But even then, so you look at of course there were, you mentioned Goldwater, Reagan, and indeed they certainly played, and Nixon certainly played footsie, or even a little bit more than that. But there was always a little, it was one level removed. There was always a bit of restraint, and I think that's because the party was not so homogenous, and there was a lot of pushback from the liberal and moderate Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans. That really changed in a big way with the Republican Revolution. Now, there were still people like, Bob Dole was having none of it. There was a real, and think about, Pat Buchanan in 1992 and 1996, a whole lot of opposition in the party to Pat Buchanan, a little of it even coming from Newt Gingrich.
Right.
So there still remains some of it then. And I would say, like a period you know a lot about, the Tea Party, there was still some of it then, and you were part of it. There was less of it. It was beginning, that I would say that responsible core of the Republican Party was being nibbled away at and nibbled away at. And by the time you get to Trump, there really wasn't enough there to fight the fight at all. And now it's been, essentially that what were once the fringe elements now are the establishment.
Well, the herd was thinning for sure. And you could see that thinning beginning in the late 50s. But for major events, Vietnam War, social revolution, on a number of fronts, that it sort of forestalled perhaps to some degree the sort of a quickening of that, because there was beneath the surface of it the political anxiety around the fact Democrats had controlled the House since 1954. So you're looking, at that point, as you get into the 80s, 30 plus years of one party rule of the House, that animated a Newt Gingrich, so much so that what Newt did, and I found this, this very interesting, narrative and storytelling in the book about how Newt sort of worked the system against itself in many respects. And by the time you get to the Contract for America, there had been a lot of use of extra externalities, like C-SPAN and the media, to sort of bring this pressure and to pull to your first point about these Southern, largely Southern white men who had broken away from the Democratic Party because of its move into civil rights. That vote was worth getting. And part of the internal battle inside the party was around whether or not that was a vote really worth getting. And I think in the end, a lot of us kind of sit there and go, see, it really wasn't worth getting.
Well, right. It depends on what your aim is. If your aim is power,
exactly.
If your aim is, making a better country, it might be something else. I overlooked in my, earlier answer, think about the autopsy of 2012. I mean, that was not, that was a decade ago, but this was a time when the RNC got people together and said, we need to be going in a different direction because of the demographics that that are still staring at us today. Need to reach out to Black Americans, to Latinos, Asian Americans, gay Americans, because otherwise you will not be able to command a majority over the long term. And I think what, even before Trump came into the picture, you had the House Republicans after that basically killing off comprehensive immigration reform. And that was the same impulse that I think gave rise to Trump. And while it is true, I mean, the way Latino voters in the long run wind up voting is still something of an open question. But it is true, at least in the short term, that even if demographics are working against Republicans, you can, if you stoke up enough fears among white voters, particularly non-college educated white men, they will turn out to vote in extraordinary number. So they will, punch above their weight in a way. And that's really the success of Trump. And what's allowing Republicans to defy gravity, I think, in some extent, is if you frighten people, they think they're losing their country, they're being targeted, the great replacement, the idea that they'll be so frightened that they'll turn out to vote in great numbers. So it's not actually wrong as a matter of, short-term politics. It is a way to drive out a lot of voters. Now, I would argue, and I think you probably agree, it's most definitely wrong in terms of the morality of politics, and I think it's also a bad idea politically in the long run. But we're not in the long run right now.
No, we're not. And in fact, you kind of touched on what you just said there in an article you did in the Post. I think it was in July of this year, where you talked about the the GOP and its leadership sort of looking at the political advantage in undermining Americans' confidence in its institutions, which takes me back to that fateful moment during inaugural week when Reince Priebus and what's his name? Why am I blanking on his name?
Bannon.
Yeah, Steve Bannon. Sat in concert at one of their events, and it was asked about what were the priorities of the incoming administration. And the third priority, which was ultimately the first priority, because I love how people do that. They tell you two things, and the last thing is what they really want to do, was deconstruct the administrative state. So there is a lot of resonance in what you're saying about how the political advantage would come not from laying out policy ideas, not from reforming within the autopsy, policy ideas, repeal and replace. Okay, here's our plan for healthcare.
Yeah.
But rather in taking Americans by the nose and pushing them into their fears, and making them afraid of others for the sake of empowering themselves.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or
yes? No,
am I
think
being too simplistic about it? But because I think that ultimately was the game plan.
Yeah, that was certainly the effect of what it was. I think the evidence is that was indeed the game plan, because it was executed over and over again. So, turning Americans against themselves, but as you alluded to, they're also turning Americans against the government.
Right.
That was very much a Newt Gingrich thing. I think that was a pivot point there, where the Republican Party went from being limited government to anti-government. In a sense. So that was the beginning of the era of the shutdowns, the contretemps with the constant debt default fights, the inability of government to basically function and get even basic things done. And I think a lot of that was, I call it, sort of throwing sand in the gears of government, and a sabotage in a sense that, first it was used to fight the Clinton administration,
right?
To deny them the ability to achieve anything. It certainly was used in a much greater extent during the Obama administration. But the idea being, if people are disenchanted with the party that's in power, the incumbent party, they will reward the opposition party, which is true to some extent, but what also wound up doing is causing Americans of all types to just become disenchanted with government overall. So there's been this huge drop. If you look at that Gallup annually looks at Americans' confidence in their institutions, just across the board over the last quarter century, there's been a drop in virtually everything. There's Congress, the White House, the press, God knows, the courts, the judicial system, business, religion. I mean, it's had a terribly ruinous effect on our democracy and our culture, even though I think it probably did result in short-term gain.
You spend a lot of time, either she's in your head or you're in hers, Sarah Palin.
And she came back in it again recently.
She knew you were writing about her. She said, no, Dana, I got some more for you, baby.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit how you see Sarah and the role that she played, because I have a slightly different perspective on Sarah Palin than most. I think more is placed on her than I think legitimately should rest at her feet. But what I see from her is her ability to express what a lot of Republicans felt at various points in time. But there was no clear orchestration like Trump of manipulating that voter. You start off, for example, and throughout you sort of talk about Sarah, but you get to the don't retread, reload chapter, which
Right,
was
right.
one of my favorites.
All right.
Let's read just a little bit from you. Say on March 23rd, 2010, the day after the House passed Obamacare, Sarah Palin sounded a call to arms, literally. Common sense conservatives and lovers of America, she tweeted, don't retreat, instead reload. Please see my Facebook page. Those visiting her Facebook page found a U.S. map with 20 congressional districts held by Democrats, each marked with a rifle crosshairs on it, right? She named the 20 Democrats and wrote, we'll aim for these races and many others. This is just the first salvo. Do you really think that Sarah Palin was articulating violence, or was she using patriot imagery in a way that a lot of the base, particularly those in the early Tea Party movement, identified with?
I think it's more the latter. And I was very careful in the book, and Lord knows that's been the controversy with the with the Giffords, the Gabby Giffords shooting and Sarah Palin.
Yes.
So to be clear, there was a deranged madman who attempted to kill Gabby Giffords, and indeed did kill, I think, 6 other people. And there was no evidence tying that to her or any other piece of rhetoric. The case I make in general is there was a whole lot of reckless and irresponsible rhetoric, which has the ability to cause the unhinged to become violent. Now, there's a long thread of this, going back to the days before the Oklahoma City bombing, where you had G. Gordon Liddy on the radio talking about shooting and killing ATF agents, the black helicopters, they're coming after you. So so I think what happened during that era, there was a lot of people whipping up a lot of paranoia about the government. They're coming after you. You got to defend yourselves. They're taking your country away. Yeah, there was a lot of gun imagery and marches with guns. So I think I don't think Sarah Palin in her head was saying, "Oh, I want to see how I can get people to go out there and shoot people." I don't think that's what she was doing at all. I just think that you could have seen that type of rhetoric would lead to violence. And then, we've seen this same sort of thing again just recently with the, all the cries about the FBI and how they're coming for you. And indeed, we've seen some actual violence as a result of that.
I agree. I agree with that, but I do also context to me is everything, and I think the context for that time and times before were very clearly different. This is than they are now, very clearly different than they are now. And this is where I think Donald Trump changed the nature of the game. Because Donald Trump was the first politician to go out and say to his audience, if someone disrupts me during my speech, slap the hell out of them.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
He was the first one to really do that. You had hot rhetoric in the past, but you had guys like John McCain, Mitt Romney, Bob Dole, George Bush, and others who would say, that's not who we are. We don't do that. So even though you may have had instances where gun references and gun imagery, or let's go and you talk about some of the things that I said was national chairman, which I'll talk about as well. The intent of the speaker, the intent of the words, how those words were received, I think matters a lot. Meaning the audience that was hearing that knew the fine line, in the very important line between y'all pick up your gun and go out and shoot somebody, and I'm using, let's go fight, don't retreat, instead reload, meaning let's go at this again, let's continue the fight and reload that way. How have we, again, from both your work as a reporter covering these periods and the research in the book, how have you seen that arc change and where all of a sudden now, when you've got the Marjorie Taylor Greens and these folks out here who literally mean you need to act violently in order to prosecute the case against our political opponents.
Yeah. So the way I've sort of argued this is, Trump was created by this system.
Yes.
So he was but I'm not arguing that it was this was this was as bad as it is now before Trump came along. He inherited this system and he made it immeasurably worse. So I'm not trying to like absolve Trump in any way of blame for what's happened. And of course he did take it to 11 with the with the violent rhetoric. The argument is, and so yes, it is certainly qualitatively different. A lot of the what I would call the violent rhetoric that preceded it, and as I've pointed out, I mean, even Chuck Schumer was out there saying, the Supreme Court justices will reap what they sow. That's inappropriate rhetoric. The difference what happened over time is you had a core of, you still have that, I believe, in the Democratic Party, but you had a core of people in the Republican Party would say, no, that's not what we stand for.
Right.
We are absolutely and inalterably opposed to violence. Beginning with the Republican Revolution, so even after Oklahoma City, you did have Newt Gingrich, coming out and saying, well, these militia groups, they have a very legitimate fear of their government.
Right.
And that was, so I think that was a breakdown there. It's starting to say.
Well, that's where the leadership has failed. That's the leadership
Exactly,
now capitulating.
Exactly.
And I would say grifting the politics of that, which would later become grifting monetarily, when they saw that those same groups and individuals start sending cash their way.
Right. So I think that, again, we're back to that sort of breakdown of the leadership, the alternative voices not rising up, and of course that reached its zenith with Donald Trump in 2016, where I think they could have indeed, had they all gotten together, they could have stopped this.
So again, in this chapter, don't retreat, reload. You quote me, and Michael Steele, chairman of the Republican National Committee, went on. This was after Sarah Palin went on Fox. You quote saying, chairman of the Republican National Committee went on Fox News the same day Palin sounded her call to arms. Let's start getting Nancy Pelosi ready for the firing line this November, he proposed. Now, we all know what that firing line was, don't we? It was the Fire Pelosi bus tour. So, and this is where the imagery of a really interesting point, because I had this debate recently with my son and some friends about comedians who could tell a joke 10 years ago, they can't tell today.
Yeah.
Right. And there are a lot of comedians sort of bitching about the fact that, this woke culture is preventing them from saying what they want to say. Similarly, in politics, a lot of the rhetoric that was used 20 years ago, certainly even 10 years ago, during my time as chairman, I wouldn't necessarily say today. So in the environment we're in right now, that line would not be a smart line to say, because of how the hearing audience would construe that as a firing squad kind of narrative, as opposed to, oh, we just want to get enough members of Congress to fire her.
Yes, yeah.
How do you see that as having handicapped the political system? That you now find yourself sort of caught, like a lot of our comedians, in this vortex where stuff you could say before has completely different meaning today, and how the audience is taking it in and hearing it.
Yes. And let me be clear for your listeners here. You, Michael Steele, are not and never were a destructionist.
I am not.
I include one of your two comments in a litany of other things here, but
it's actually a good illustration of the point we're talking about, is that this idea that the rhetoric does kind of drive the conversation. It can.
Mm-hmm.
It can influence the behavior. And if you're not smart about how that's being perceived, or you're
Yeah.
not sensitive to how voters and your audience is taking it in, it can
Mm-hmm.
lead to some dangerous stuff.
Right. So I was, I was talking about the cumulative effect of a lot of things at that time. You had that. I don't have the book in front of me. Mike Vanderbough, I think it was. He was talking about, throwing bricks through the windows.
Yes.
Of
Yes.
Democrats. This guy went out and cut the gas line of a congressman in Virginia. Or I think he actually did it to the congressman's brother's house because he got the address wrong.
Right. You say here, a Tea Party activist suggesting people drop by the home of Representative Tom Perriello,
Right.
a Virginia Democrat, posted Perriello's brother's Charlottesville address online, thinking it was the congressman, and somebody did indeed drop by and cut a gas line.
Yeah, right. There was that, and then I remember there was a rally with these guys carrying their automatic weapons at a park in Virginia, just across the Potomac from Washington. So there was, I think that was a period like 94 or 95, and like the current one, where just rhetoric became very heated. And when you get into that sort of a situation,
right,
you are almost inevitably looking at violence. I think it's infinitely more dangerous right now because it's coming from the highest levels, and there's nobody contradicting it, and there's nobody saying
there's no adult in the room. There's no one being the mommy and the daddy saying, "I'm sorry, children, get in the corner. You're on timeout."
Right. We are not. People are not for hitting.
People are not for hitting.
That's
right.
We don't settle our differences this way. And you've had Trump, repeatedly saying now, if he's indicted, there's people are not going to accept it. It's pretty openly either, they would say predicting violence, which is bad enough, or actively threatening violence. The two are pretty closely related.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back with Dana, we're going to talk about what this all means going forward as we are entering the next political cycle post 2020, post January 6th, and how he sees all of this influencing and shaping the road ahead. More with Dana Milbank, author of The Destructionists, the 25-year crack of the Republican Party, right after this. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Michael Steele, and we're having a good conversation with my buddy Dana Milbank. And look, just so folks know, Dana and I have butted heads over the years in the various roles that I've played in politics. He's always been one of those tenacious kind of Washington reporters. When you see his name pop up on your phone and go, "Oh God, I got to answer this call." But Dana's a good brother. He's written a great book, The Deconstructionists, the 25-year crack of the Republican Party. So Dana, as you sort of lay bare the landscape of how we sort of emerged where we are, the various players that have played out these scenarios, and rightly noting that Trump was really kind of the Frankenstein's monster that was kind of created. When you look at the Mitch McConnells of the world and the Kevin McCarthy's, and even the guys who got burned and chewed up by the system, the John Boehners and Paul Ryans. I mean, people forget these very same Republicans took out 2 Republican speakers.
Yep.
What does that tell you about what's happening inside the Republican Party itself?
Well, I think it set about this this sort of a revolutionary idea, that the idea is you can't compromise. I mean, compromise is the enemy. And of course, if you have if you're the leader of a party that says you can't compromise on anything, it's impossible to lead. It's impossible to lead. I mean, Newt Gingrich himself was out of power after 4 years. He was the victim. He survived a coup in the first instance, and then he was felled by a coup.
Right. So we've taken out 3 Republican speakers. I have to forget about.
Over and over again. And John Boehner couldn't control them. Paul Ryan couldn't control them. I mean, I don't know anybody who thinks that Kevin McCarthy for a moment can control them. Elise
No.
Stefanik is taking a step down, so she doesn't have to be blamed for the inability to control them. But,
Right.
uh, the whole idea, and I actually talk about Eric Cantor in this book a lot. He was another victim
Mm-hmm.
of this
Mm-hmm.
kind of politics. He may well have emerged as the Speaker of the House, but was overthrown by a revolutionary. I think they got into this trap where the most extreme positions and candidates were rewarded, and of
Mm.
course, so then you're in power, and then the next iteration becomes more extreme. So you're constantly. I mean, there are various reasons for this, but I mean, some of it's fairly natural. I mean, but if you look at uh, it's probably 95% of House seats at this point are relatively safe.
Right.
The only way you are going to be to lose your seat is if you've lost it in a primary.
Right.
The only way all but a few of these Republicans could lose their seats is if they're outflanked on their right. So it was a culture brought about by Gingrich of sort of constantly thwarting, constantly sabotaging, the constant bomb throwing. But it turns out when you are constantly throwing bombs, you can't actually govern because it requires consensus building. It requires compromise. This is what Bob Michael, the Republican leader before
Right.
Newt, was all about. And I would argue, yes, the Republicans were in the minority, but they got Ronald Reagan's agenda, or a substantial part of it, through a Democratic House of Representatives. So, consensus building actually, demonstrably succeeded. But, what I think what's happened is we've had a series of iterations that move things more extreme, partially in ideology, but more in terms of an absolute refusal to compromise. The other side isn't your opponent who disagrees with you. They're your enemy, and they have to be defeated. So if you believe the other side are traitors, was a
Right.
word that Gingrich pioneered to refer to the political opposition, that they're corrupt and they're traitors and they don't want what's best for their country. Well, how can you compromise with them? That would be unethical to compromise with traitors to the country. So you've got, so if you're John Boehner or Paul Ryan or Kevin McCarthy, and you're leading a bunch of people who think that the other side are traitors to the country, well, of course you can't. You're not going to be able to govern them. That's there's
Well,
just
and you actually, I mean, you touch on something that I think can't be overlooked. Even in Newt Gingrich's era, despite his firebrand approach and his upsetting of the internal workings of the House, which Bob Michael and Jim Wright both lamented,
hmm
especially as Jim Wright was being taken down for
hmm
the postal scandal and
right.
other things in the House at the time, was that the body politic still allowed for the body of policy to
hmm
get accomplished.
hmm
What we have now is complete and utter control of the body policy, the body of the policy work that
hmm
needs to be done, wiped out by the politics. To your point, you
Yeah.
can't compromise, you can't even hint that you want to have a conversation. And people make a big. Just look at what we saw, even among Democrats,
hmm
between Sinema and Manchin,
hmm
having to deal with AOC and that
hmm
cadre of progressives. As I keep warning Democrats, you look at us and laugh, baby, you better turn around and look what's
Yeah.
happening behind you.
Right, and that's actually an instructive comparison. You have uh, during the Gingrich time, as we've discussed, there were these shutdowns, but you had Bob Dole step in and say, "This is over. We're not doing
Right.
this. We're done with this, guys." Um, during the next time around, during the 2010 or so, and after that, you had John Boehner step in and say, "We're done with this. We're done with the Ted Cruz shutdown," is
Right.
what he would have called it at the time. Um, the thing is, but that weakened Boehner. You could only stand up. You could only stand up to them for so long.
Right.
And I think what's happened, in Paul Ryan, I would argue, didn't even, he tried significantly less to stand up to them. And Kevin McCarthy clearly is being dictated by whatever the extreme element. So he's not even trying to. So, in the Democratic Party, you still have, a Nancy Pelosi who will say, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing the Green New Deal. We're not doing
Right.
Medicare for all. We're not doing defund the police. We're doing it this way. So they still exist. Now there is a threat that you could have a parallel thing happen, in the Democratic Party with sort of the socialist, the woke, whatever we're
Right.
talking about. There's a structural difference because there are far fewer Americans who identify as liberal than identify as conservative. So they just don't have as much of a foothold. The ideologues don't have as much of a foothold.
Right.
There was just a study, in fact, I wrote about last week at the Brookings Institution, of all the Democratic candidates for Congress this cycle. There were 1.5% of them self-identified as socialist.
Socialist.
Now more would identify, but but if you look at the defund the Green New Deal, they're actually fairly minuscule in terms of their role in the party. So in part, there are still leaders in the Democratic Party who can stand up to them, but I don't want to give the leaders too much credit because the extremist faction doesn't have as much relative power within the caucus, so it has been easier. But there's definitely the danger of that there could be, an equal and opposite reaction that could damage the Democratic Party in the same way.
Yeah, and so having said that, how would you then assess the use of power within the organization itself? So prior to um, the probably 2000, well, the Bush administration in that period, shortly after that, you sort of had the weakening of the ability of Congress to use power within to control its members. So you didn't have the ability to say to a congressman, well, there's certain projects you like to have in your district. You just won't be getting those projects now, will you? When you take away that authority, and this is what I found interesting, Republicans didn't know what to do or how to use the perceived or real power of the office of Speaker, the office of Majority Leader, office of Whip, to control their post 2012 Tea Party, which became their Freedom Caucus, right? Democrats seemingly still knew how to do that. Nancy Pelosi, while she didn't have the ability directly, seemingly had the ability to kind of shut down a lot more of the progressive stuff that the Squad and others were trying to promote than Republican leaders were able to do with their Tea Party and Freedom Fighters or Freedom Caucus.
Yeah, I mean,
Is that because a woman does it better than a man, or
we'll get points for saying so, won't we? But but no, I mean, look, both parties are a whole lot weaker because the real power that they had over their members was money. And that doesn't exist anymore because it's so dominated by outside money. The parties really don't have the ability to keep them in line that way. But I think the bigger difference among the two is simply the Fox News effect. And Boehner wrote about this quite a bit, but that he was powerless because Fox News was empowering these backbenchers, and if they didn't get what they wanted, they could go to complain to Fox News. There really isn't. Yes, there's MSNBC, but in terms of just this, stranglehold over the Republican electorate, there's just no equivalent
Yeah,
to
I
that.
agree with that.
It's much more fragmented, and I would argue much more political. In terms of, I wrote a lot about Fox News in here, but it's very much tied in with Republican politics, and has been from the very beginning with Roger Ailes. So Nancy Pelosi doesn't have to contend with a similar force. It was Fox News, and before that it was conservative talk radio. But so I think that the combination of Fox News, the Rush Limbaugh effect, and then you add in the loss of because of changes in campaign finance and
Right.
Citizens United and dark money, particularly in the Republican Party, the party apparatus lost all ability to control, to rein them in. And then, I would argue that when it still had a little bit left, in 2016, it, had enough to stand up and defy. I think you had the likes of Mitch McConnell say, all right, we'll just, make a deal with the devil. We'll get through this.
Right, because we can control the devil.
We can control him. We'll get our justices,
right,
and then we'll go back to business as usual. Well, they did get their justices, but we're not going back to business as usual.
Not anytime soon. Not anytime soon. So, how do you, as you look at where we are at this point, 50 some days out from, if not 50 days out from the November elections, given this sort of deconstructionist view of American politics by the Republican Party, and not just a deconstructionist view, but a deconstructionist effort by the party. Mm-hmm. How do you see 2022 shaping up? You wrote recently in a piece that the red wave was more like a sort of, what you call it, a ripple,
a ripple, yeah.
A little ripple.
Yeah.
I am almost seeing the ripple become sort of placid sea, a placid. Because I think the Democrats have stumbled on some advantages if they learn how to do politics between now and November, right. That they can take advantage of. I asked a Democratic friend, I said, did it ever occur to you just sort of just ask me how you can beat us? I mean, it's like, it's not complicated. And the Republicans are going, you mean they haven't figured this part out yet? But how do you look at the remaining part of the arc that you write about over this 25-year period? Because it really hasn't hit a plateau, or really hasn't. It's still moving. It's still kind of doing its thing.
Yeah. Well, I learned my lesson in 2016 not to make predictions of any sort. But I said that the Republicans are too good for Donald Trump. They will reject him. I never said he would lose the general. Right. I was worried he might win the general election, but I said Republicans just won't accept this. And I said if they do, if he wins, I will eat my column. So we had to cook up my column, and I had to eat it. So even when I made, I'm not making a prediction about the midterms. I'm saying. Right. If we look at it at this point in time, and the way it looks right now is unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's not that, Republicans are behaving the way you would expect the opposition party to. They're very riled up. They really want change. They're going to go out there and vote Republican. Right. But what we're seeing now that we've pretty much never seen before is the incumbent party. The Democrats are just as riled up.
Right. Right.
So, it's the Dobbs decision, but I think it's also there's almost a universal sense among everybody now that things have gone terribly wrong, and everybody recognizes there's an existential threat to our way of life, to our democracy. So signs suggest they're going to be showing up at 2018 levels and possibly at presidential levels. So, that's the way it looks right now. And if you have presidential level turnout, that tends to be good for the Democrats, simply because there are more of them
Right, right.
if they all show up. So, it's, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say thank you, Donald Trump, for increasing voter turnout, because it's, basically everybody's, hysterical and seeing a threat to our way of life. But it does seem that all the old models are now broken, and we're entering a new and completely unpredictable phase here. But at the I mean, if there is a silver lining, it is good to see people engaged.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And so before I let you jump up out of here, uh, how do you see, or where do you see the GOP headed? I get a lot of questions. I get two predominantly among the many that I get. And one is, why are you still a Republican?
Hmm.
And two is, what happens to the Republican Party?
Hmm.
There is my sense that there's still this sort of nostalgic view, or sort of nostalgic thinking about the GOP, and hope that the party
Hmm.
kind of returns to its old governable self,
Hmm.
right? I think that's just some bad marijuana that someone's smoking right now. I just don't think that that's going to happen. But it does beg the question, what do you see next?
Hmm.
And after all the time you put in telling us this story and sharing uh, the various pieces that kind of propped up this thing that now calls itself the GOP, what do you see happening next?
Well, in it's, first of all, it's in everybody's interest for there to be a strong, healthy Republican Party. I mean, we live in a two-party system.
Right.
We basically at this point need that for democracy.
It's a third
Uh,
party viable at
I've
some point.
I've seen no evidence of this. I mean, the only way third parties become viable is they replace one of the two. So I mean, it's
Fair point. Yeah.
viable. Viable. It's always viable in that sense. Um, Look, in the long run, I think that I still believe that the demographics say, this you can't have an angry, frightened white minority dominate the country.
Right.
That just can't happen. So I think ultimately, um, uh, you know, the changes come about that just make the Republican Party as it now exists will drive it into extinction. Now people say, well, yes, but Latinos may wind up voting Republicans, and that may happen if the Republican Party changes itself in some way. But if the Republican Party is changing itself in that way, well, that's also a beneficial outcome of
Yeah.
this. As long as Venezuelan refugees are being sent to Martha's Vineyard, to being exploited for a political stunt, I just don't see Latino voters flocking to the Republican Party in the long run. So, you know, I, one of two things happens. The party becomes, well, I should say one of three things. The party becomes irrelevant.
Hmm.
Um, the party does begin to evolve more in the way it was outlined in 2012,
Hmm.
or God forbid, it erupts in something more violent than what we've seen, and there have been some worrisome signs of that lately. I'm not very optimistic in the short run. I don't see any of the trend lines pointing in the right direction here. But I also know that this won't be sustained for a long period of time.
Yeah, I agree with you on the trend lines. I certainly, in reading the book, appreciate this destructionist view, because it is something that it's been in the political ether for some time, and many of us have tried to pump in some fresh air, but that seems harder and harder to do these days.
Yeah.
So I think you're right in terms of where this ultimately may play out. Whether there is some reformation or some peeling off, we'll see. I mean, this is not the Whigs and the formation of the Republican Party over an issue like slavery. So it's a very different kind of dynamic, and it puts a different kind of pressure because you've got Facebook, Twitter, and all these other assets that change the way people interact and learn and understand. Look, if you can't agree that the 2020 election was a legitimately held and executed election, you don't have too many places to get to after that.
Right. And look, one thing that gives me hope, Michael, is there are people like you who are still fighting this battle because
that's because we're crazy.
Well, you got to be a little crazy, I guess. Right. I mean, people ask me, do they, come on, the Republicans, if they secretly don't really believe this stuff, and what I say is you don't really understand how much pressure they're under because, I mean, if you're in politics, sure, you'll be cast out of politics like Liz Cheney, but it's more than that. It's like, we are a nation segregated by party right now, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's not, forget about race. It's, it's party. You live in areas with people from your party. Your kids go to school with, children of like-minded partisans. You worship with like-minded partisans. Yep. So if you defy the party, you're cast out socially, financially, politically. So, for me to stand up and say destructionists, that's relatively easy. But, for people who, for a former Republican national chairman, a former elected Republican official to say, no, I'm standing against this. This is wrong. That's hard as hell. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Well, that's why gin and tonic, 10 a.m. That's how you get through the day. Dana Milbank, he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Deconstructionists, the 25-year crack of the Republican Party. And it was a real treat getting you on, man, to talk about the book and the work that you put into it, the analysis you bring to our current political system. Very much appreciated, man.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate you. Keep on fighting.
I will. I don't know how to do anything else. I just don't. I've been fighting since I was a county chairman. What can I say? Yeah. Look, when you grow up in D.C., outnumbered 10-1 as a Black Republican, you gotta work it out quick, Yep.
You've had practice.
So I went and got Marion Barry as a political mentor. So I figured, okay, I found some secrets here how they do this. But I appreciate you, man. I really do. It has been fun working with you over the years, and always continued success and best luck to you in the effort. And again, folks, the book is The Deconstructionists. Pick up a copy. You will enjoy it. Follow Dana on Twitter @Milbank. Follow him and keep up with his reporting at the Washington Post. Until next time, guys, take it easy out there. Do the download thing. I love it when you do. You get me on Spreaker and certainly Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And follow me on Twitter @Michael Steele and the podcast @Steele_podcast. Take care.